The sun beat down mercilessly on Hannah Keller's bent back as she struggled with the stubborn plow, her fingers raw and bleeding from hours of work. The Oklahoma Territory of 1885 showed no mercy to a woman alone, especially not a widow with 40 acres of untilled soil and a harvest season that wouldn't wait for grief to subside. Hannah wiped sweat from her brow with a dirt-streaked forearm, leaving a smudge across her face. 6 weeks since Thomas had been laid to rest, 6 weeks of neighbors' pitying glances, 6 weeks of trying to prove she could manage alone. The drought-hardened earth fought her at every turn, the old wooden plow barely scratching the surface. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, and the mule stood stubbornly in place, as if sensing the futility of her efforts. "Madam, you're liable to work yourself into the ground that way." The deep voice startled Hannah so badly she nearly toppled over. Shielding her eyes against the glaring sun, she found herself staring up at a tall stranger atop a chestnut stallion. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with several days' worth of stubble. "My business is my own," Hannah replied, her voice hoarse from thirst, "and you're trespassing on my land." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. Up close, she could see his eyes clear blue like the sky after a storm, assessing her situation with unnerving accuracy. "Jake Morgan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm passing through to Colorado. Meant no offense, but that field won't plow itself the way you're going about it." Hannah straightened her back, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Mr. Morgan." Jake's eyes traveled from her blistered hands to the barely scratched field behind her. Without another word, he approached the mule, whispering something that made the stubborn animal's ears prick up. Then he turned to Hannah. "A field this size needs a proper team and a steel plow," he said, not unkindly. "You'll kill yourself trying to do it alone." "I have no choice," Hannah snapped, heat rising to her cheeks. "My husband died before spring planting, and if I don't get a crop in soon, I'll lose everything." Something in Jake's expression softened. He glanced at the small farmhouse in the distance, the weathered barn leaning slightly to one side, and then back to Hannah's determined face. "Let me help," he said simply, removing his hat and coat. "You've done enough for today." "I don't need charity," Hannah protested, even as her arms screamed with relief at the momentary rest. Jake took the plow handles from her, his calloused hands brushing against hers. "It's not charity, madam, it's being neighborly. We're not neighbors. You said yourself you're passing through." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then consider it payment for water for my horse and perhaps a meal if you can spare it." Before Hannah could form another objection, Jake had positioned himself behind the plow. With a gentle command and a click of his tongue, he got the mule moving forward. "You'll rest now," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying on the hot breeze. "I'll have this section done before sundown." Hannah opened her mouth to protest again, but found herself without words as the stranger began cutting a clean, straight furrow through the resistant earth. The mule that had fought her all morning now moved steadily forward, responding to Jake's quiet commands. Hannah stood rooted to the spot, torn between pride and practicality. Her land needed plowing, and this stranger was doing in minutes what had taken her hours to attempt. With reluctance born of necessity, she turned toward the house to prepare a meal for her unexpected helper. As Hannah walked away, she couldn't help glancing back at Jake Morgan. The late afternoon sun gilded his broad shoulders as he guided the plow with practiced ease. For the first time in weeks, a small weight lifted from Hannah's chest. Perhaps she could rest, if only for today. The simple farmhouse kitchen was stifling despite the open windows. Hannah pumped water into a basin and scrubbed her hands and face, wincing as the water stung her raw skin. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand's sun-browned face, strands of auburn hair escaping her braid, eyes too old for her 24 years. Thomas had been gone only 6 weeks, but it felt like a lifetime. They'd come to Oklahoma 3 years ago, full of dreams for their homestead. Now those dreams lay buried alongside him, victim to a fever that had swept through the territory like wildfire. Hannah pushed away the memory of her husband's face and focused on the practical matter of feeding her unexpected guest. She stoked the cook stove and began preparations for a simple meal of cornbread and bean stew, humble fare, but the best she could offer. From the kitchen window, she watched Jake Morgan work her field with an efficiency that both impressed and humbled her. Each row he plowed was a stark reminder of her own inadequacy, yet she couldn't deny the relief of seeing progress on the land that had defeated her daily efforts. By the time Jake led the mule back to the barn, the sun was setting, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. Hannah stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, watching his approach. His shirt clung to his back, darkened with sweat, but his stride remained steady. "That's a good start," he said, removing his hat as he reached the porch steps. "Your mule's sturdy, but he's getting on in years, needs a gentler hand." "My husband always handled the plowing," Hannah admitted, the words tasting bitter. "I'm learning as I go." Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Most skills can be learned given time." He gestured toward the water pump. "May I?" At Hannah's nod, he moved to the pump and worked the handle, splashing water over his face and neck. The simple action somehow transformed her yard into something different, a place where life continued, where mundane tasks carried on despite loss. "Supper's ready if you're still interested in that meal," Hannah said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Jake looked up, water dripping from his face. "Much obliged, Mrs. Keller." "Hannah Keller, Mrs. Keller." He nodded respectfully. "I'll just tend to my horse if that's all right." As Jake disappeared into the barn, Hannah returned to the kitchen, setting 2 plates on the worn wooden table. It felt strange preparing for a guest, stranger still that the guest was a man she'd never met before today. What would the neighbors think? Mrs. Peterson from the adjacent farm already watched Hannah with suspicious eyes, as if widowhood might be contagious. Hannah pushed the thought away. She needed help, and Jake Morgan had offered it without expectation. That was all. When Jake entered the kitchen, he'd made an effort to clean up. His hair, dark brown with hints of gold where the sun had lightened it, was damp and combed back from his forehead. He'd rolled his sleeves to the elbow, revealing forearms corded with muscle. "Smells good," he said, standing awkwardly until Hannah gestured to a chair. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional call of a whippoorwill outside. Hannah found herself studying her guest when he wasn't looking. His hands were strong but moved with surprising grace. A thin scar ran along his left jawline, and crow's feet had begun to form at the corners of his eyes. Not a young man, but not old either, perhaps 30 or so. "How far is it to Colorado?" Hannah asked finally, needing to break the uncomfortable silence Jake finished chewing before answering. 2 weeks, give or take, depends on the weather and if the rivers are fordable. What's waiting for you there?" Something flickered across his face, caution, perhaps. "A fresh start." Hannah nodded, recognizing the desire. "That's what Oklahoma was supposed to be for us." "Your husband was a farmer," he wanted to be. Hannah's throat tightened. "He was a blacksmith by trade, but he dreamed of growing things. We saved every penny for 5 years to claim this land." Jake's eyes softened. "It's good land, rich soil beneath that stubborn top layer." "You know farming." "I was raised on a ranch in Texas," he replied. "Grew up knowing the rhythms of the land." Hannah hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind since he'd first taken the plow. "Why did you stop? To help me, I mean." Jake set down his spoon, his gaze direct. "Where I come from, you don't pass by someone in need, especially not a woman working a field alone." He paused. "Besides, I've been on the receiving end of unexpected kindness. Sometimes it's all that keeps a person going." The simple honesty in his words touched something in Hannah. She'd been so focused on proving her independence that she'd forgotten the value of human connection. "Well, thank you," she said quietly. "For the help and the company." Jake nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Best meal I've had in weeks, that's thanks enough." After supper, Jake insisted on washing the dishes while Hannah prepared a pallet for him in the barn. She'd offered the spare room, but he'd declined, citing propriety. Now, as moonlight spilled through the kitchen window, Hannah found herself lingering, reluctant to end this brief respite from solitude. "I can stay a few days," Jake said suddenly, drying his hands on a towel. "Help you get the field ready for planting." Hannah stared at him, caught between hope and suspicion. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "but I know what it's like to face an impossible task alone." He hung the towel carefully on its hook. "I'm not in any particular hurry to reach Colorado. The mountains have stood for thousands of years. They'll wait another week." Hannah wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage, but the memory of his efficient work in the field compared to her futile struggles made the decision for her. "I can't pay you," she said. "Not with money." "Room and board is payment enough," Jake replied, "and maybe some of that cornbread for the trail when I go." Despite herself, Hannah smiled. "I think that can be arranged." As she showed Jake to the barn, the night air cool against her skin, Hannah felt a curious mixture of relief and trepidation. She just invited a stranger to stay on her property, a man she knew nothing about beyond his name and his capable hands on a plow. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she said formally, hanging a lantern on a hook near the barn door. "Jake," he corrected gently. "If I'm staying a while, Mr. Morgan seems too formal." Hannah nodded, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd spoken a man's first name aloud. "Good night, Jake." As she walked back to the empty house, Hannah could feel his eyes following her, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she was acutely conscious of being a woman alone in the world, not just for the dangers it presented, but for the possibilities as well. Morning arrived with the insistent crowing of Hannah's rooster. She dressed quickly, ashamed to have slept later than usual. The physical toll of her failed plowing attempts, combined with the relief of having help, had sent her into a deep, dreamless sleep. To her surprise, Jake was already in the barnyard, feeding the chickens and filling the water trough. He'd found Thomas's old work shirt hanging in the barn and had changed into it, the fabric stretched across his broader shoulders, but it was cleaner than his travel-worn clothes. "Hope you don't mind," he said, nodding to the shirt when he caught her looking. "Figured it was better to work in clean clothes." Hannah swallowed hard. The sight of Thomas's shirt on another man's body should have upset her, but instead she felt an odd sense of rightness, as if the garment was fulfilling its purpose rather than hanging uselessly as a reminder of loss. "It's fine," she managed. "There's coffee on the stove." They fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine over breakfast. Jake asked practical questions about the farm, how many acres she hoped to plant, what crops had done well in previous years, whether there was a creek on the property for irrigation. "The northeast corner has the best soil," Hannah explained, warming to the subject. "Thomas always said it would grow corn tall enough to touch the sky, but we need to plant more than just corn. Beans and squash too, if I'm to make it through winter." Jake listened attentively, occasionally offering suggestions based on his own experience. By the time they finished eating, they had formulated a plan for the day's work. "I'll harness both your mules today," Jake said. "Double the pulling power, we should get twice as much done." Hannah nodded, grateful for his knowledge. "I'll work on clearing the stones from the eastern section while you plow." Jake studied her for a moment, his blue eyes serious. "Your hands are raw from yesterday. Why don't you tend to the house chores today?" "I saw patches in the barn roof that need fixing before the next rain." Hannah bristled instinctively. "I'm not made of porcelain, Mr. Morgan." "Jake," he corrected again, his voice patient, "and I never suggested you were, but working smart means playing to our strengths. I've been behind a plow since I was 12 years old. You know this house and what needs fixing." Put that way, it made practical sense. Hannah reluctantly agreed, and they parted to their separate tasks, Jake to the fields, Hannah to assess the repairs needed around the homestead. As the day progressed, Hannah found herself repeatedly drawn to the window that overlooked the field. Jake worked steadily, the muscles in his back and arms flexing with each movement. By midday, he had plowed more land than she could have managed in a week. The knowledge was both humbling and freeing. Hannah had been so determined to prove she could do everything Thomas had done that she'd nearly worked herself to collapse. Watching Jake's efficient progress forced her to acknowledge a difficult truth. Some tasks required strength she simply didn't possess, but that didn't make her weak or incapable. As she patched holes in the chicken coop and mended the garden fence, Hannah realized she was contributing equally valuable work to the farm's survival. At noon, she carried a jug of water and some bread and cheese to the field. Jake stopped willingly, wiping sweat from his brow as he accepted the water. "You've made good progress," Hannah said, surveying the neat furrows stretching across what had been unbroken ground that morning. Jake drank deeply before answering. "Good mules once they understand what you want. And the soil's turning over nicely now that we've broken through the top crust." Hannah handed him the food, noticing the blisters forming on his palms despite his calluses. "You're hurting your hands for my benefit." Jake shrugged, tearing off a piece of bread. "They'll toughen up again." Had gotten soft doing other work these past months. "What kind of work?" Hannah asked, curious about this man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. A shadow passed over Jake's face. "This and that, cattle driving mostly." He changed the subject quickly. "How are the repairs coming?" Hannah allowed the deflection, describing the work she'd completed around the homestead. As they talked, she found herself relaxing in his presence. There was something steadying about Jake Morgan, a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. By the third day of Jake's stay, they had settled into a comfortable partnership. Jake worked the fields from sunrise until mid-afternoon, then helped with repairs around the farm. Hannah tended to the house, garden, and animals and prepared the meals. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass as they discussed the next day's tasks. "If the weather holds, we should finish plowing by the end of the week," Jake said, whittling a piece of wood as he spoke. His hands were never idle, Hannah had noticed. "And then planting," Hannah murmured, her mind already racing ahead to the next challenge. "I've saved seed from last year's harvest, but it won't be enough for all the acreage," Jake nodded thoughtfully. "There's a trading post about 10 miles east. They might have seed for sale." "I don't have much to trade," Hannah admitted. What money Thomas left went to the doctor bills and funeral. Jake's knife paused in its rhythmic scraping. "I noticed some fine leather work in the barn, bridles and such. Your husband's work," Hannah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "He was known for it. People came from 3 counties away to commission pieces. Do you have any completed pieces that weren't sold?" "A few." Thomas was working on an order for a ranch owner near Fort Smith when he fell ill. Jake's eyes lit up. "That could be your trade." "Good leather work always finds a buyer." The suggestion kindled a spark of hope in Hannah's chest. She hadn't thought about Thomas's leatherwork as a potential asset. It had been too painful to enter his workshop after his death. But Jake was right. The completed pieces represented not just memories, but a practical resource. "I'll show you tomorrow," she said, surprising herself with the offer. That night, Hannah lay awake longer than usual, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Closer, in the barn, she could occasionally hear movement as Jake or his horse shifted in the darkness. In just 3 days, this stranger had transformed from an unwelcome intruder to a trusted ally. Hannah examined her feelings carefully, wary of the comfort she'd begun to find in Jake's presence. Was it merely gratitude for his help? Or was there something more, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge? Thomas had been her first and only love, a childhood sweetheart who had courted her with patient determination. Their marriage had been one of deep affection and shared dreams. His death had left a void Hannah hadn't believed could ever be filled. Yet now, as she drifted toward sleep, it was Jake Morgan's steady blue gaze that followed her into dreams not of the past, but of possibilities that lay ahead. Morning brought a welcome surprise, a light rain that provided a day's respite from fieldwork. Hannah found Jake in the barn, carefully examining her mule's hooves. "This one's got a stone bruise," he explained, gently setting down the hoof he'd been inspecting. "Nothing serious, but he could use a day off. The rain's a blessing anyway," Hannah said. "For the first time in weeks, I'm not worried about the soil being too dry." Jake straightened, brushing straw from his trousers. "Good day to visit that workshop you mentioned." Hannah hesitated, then nodded. The leather shop had been Thomas's domain, his private sanctuary. She'd avoided it since his death, unable to face the unfinished projects and lingering scent of him in the small outbuilding. "It's this way," she said, leading Jake across the muddy yard to a sturdy structure built against the side of the barn. The door creaked as Hannah pushed it open, disturbing dust motes that danced in the beam of light from the single window. The familiar smell of leather and neatsfoot oil wrapped around her like an embrace, momentarily stealing her breath. Everything remained exactly as Thomas had left it, tools arranged precisely on the workbench, patterns hanging from pegs on the wall, a half-finished bridle still clamped to the wooden form. Hannah's hand trembled as she touched the smooth leather. "He was talented," Jake said quietly, examining a completed saddle that stood in the corner. His fingers traced the intricate tooling with appreciation. "This is master-level work." Pride momentarily overshadowed Hannah's grief. "He apprenticed with a saddle maker in St. Louis before we came west. Said he could feel the story of the hide in his hands, know exactly what it wanted to become." Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My father was a woodworker, had the same way about him, could look at a piece of oak and see the table hidden inside." Hannah moved to a chest against the wall, lifting the heavy lid to reveal several completed pieces wrapped in soft cloth. "These are the items he finished before he got sick. A bridle set, 2 belts with silver buckles, and a pair of saddlebags." Jake carefully examined each piece, whistling softly at the craftsmanship. "These would fetch a good price at any trading post between here and Denver, enough for seed and maybe some store goods besides." Hope fluttered in Hannah's chest. "You really think so?" "I know so." Jake rewrapped the pieces carefully. "We could ride to the trading post tomorrow if the weather clears." "We?" Hannah questioned, surprised by the assumption. Jake's expression grew serious. "A woman traveling alone with valuable goods is a target, Mrs. Keller. I wouldn't be doing my duty if I let you make that journey unaccompanied." Hannah wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but practicality won out. The trading post lay through stretches of isolated country, and Jake was right, a lone woman would be vulnerable. "Very well," she conceded. "But I'll do the trading. These are my husband's pieces." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Jake agreed easily. As they left the workshop, Hannah found herself reluctant to close the door. For months, she'd avoided this space, allowing dust to gather on Thomas's legacy. Now, seeing his work through Jake's appreciative eyes, she felt a connection to her husband that grief had temporarily severed. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at Jake. "For what?" "For helping me remember there's value in what was left behind." Hannah finally met his gaze. "Not just sorrow." Jake's eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. "Sometimes it takes a stranger to help us see what's been in front of us all along." The trip to the trading post the following day marked a turning point in Hannah and Jake's relationship. Riding side by side along the rutted trail, they shared stories of their past lives, Hannah describing her childhood in Kentucky, Jake speaking of his years on his family's Texas ranch. "What happened to the ranch?" Hannah asked as they forded a shallow stream. Jake's expression darkened. "War came. Then drought, then taxes." His shoulders tensed beneath his jacket. "My father died defending land that wasn't worth the blood he shed for it." Hannah heard the bitterness in his voice. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," Jake said, though his tone suggested the wound remained fresh. "Taught me not to put too much stock in permanence." "Is that why you're heading to Colorado, to avoid putting down roots?" Jake smiled faintly. "Perceptive, Mrs. Keller." He adjusted his hat against the midday sun. "Truth is, I've been drifting so long I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." "And yet you've stayed to help me," Hannah observed. "That's different." Jake's eyes met hers briefly. "Helping someone in need isn't the same as belonging somewhere." The trading post exceeded Hannah's expectations. Jenkins, the gruff proprietor, examined Thomas's leatherwork with grudging admiration and offered a fair price, enough for seed, supplies, and even a small reserve of cash. Jake remained silent during the negotiations, his presence supportive without being intrusive. "Your man does fine work, madam," Jenkins said as he counted out coins. Be sure to bring more when he completes it. Hannah's throat tightened. My husband passed on this winter, Mr. Jenkins. These are the last pieces he'll make. Jenkins had the grace to look abashed. My condolences, quality like this is rare in these parts. As Hannah and Jake loaded their purchases onto their horses, Jenkins called after them. Storm brewing to the west. Might want to make haste or find shelter before nightfall. The warning proved accurate. Halfway home, dark clouds boiled on the horizon and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Jake pointed to a stand of cottonwoods along a creek bed. We should wait it out there, he shouted over the rising wind. That's a gully washer coming, and the trail will turn to mud in minutes. They barely reached the shelter of the trees before the storm hit with full force. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the world gray. Jake quickly constructed a makeshift lean-to using his oilskin coat and some branches, creating just enough space for them to huddle together. Relatively dry, lightning cracked overhead, followed immediately by a boom of thunder that Hannah felt in her chest. Despite her best efforts, she flinched. Not fond of storms? Jake asked, his voice close to her ear. Hannah shook her head. Never have been. My mother used to say God was rearranging furniture in heaven during thunderstorms, but that never made them less frightening. Jake chuckled, the sound warm in the cold, wet air. My grandmother said the thunder was the great spirit arguing with the wind spirits. Didn't make me any braver either. Another flash of lightning illuminated the temporary shelter, and Hannah became acutely aware of Jake's proximity. Their shoulders touched, and she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing. For the first time since Thomas's death, Hannah felt the stirring of feelings she had thought permanently extinguished, a warmth that had nothing to do with the shelter from the storm. Tell me about Colorado, she said suddenly, needing to distract herself from these unexpected sensations. What's waiting for you there? Jake was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if choosing each word with care. A chance, he said simply. My cousin has land near Denver, wrote that he could use a partner with ranching experience. He paused. It's not much, but it's a direction at least. That sounds like more than a chance, Hannah observed. It sounds like a future. Jake shifted beside her, his arm brushing hers. Maybe, if I can stay in one place long enough to build one. The vulnerability in his admission touched Hannah deeply. Here was a man who had helped her without hesitation, yet doubted his own ability to create a stable life. What makes it so hard? She asked softly. Staying in one place, thunder rumbled again, more distant now as the storm began to move away. In the brief silence that followed, Hannah thought Jake might not answer. After the war, after my father died, he finally said, I rode with some men who weren't particular about the right side of the law. His voice remained steady, but Hannah could sense the tension in his body. Never killed anyone, but I stood by while others did, helped rob a stage once, ran with a cattle-rustling outfit for nearly a year. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. This confession wasn't what she had expected. 3 years back, I watched a man die because I didn't speak up when I should have, Jake continued, staring out at the rain. An innocent man. Something broke in me that day. I left that life behind, worked honest jobs since then, but... He sighed heavily. Hard to outrun your own shadow, Mrs. Keller. Hannah, she corrected quietly. If he could share his darkest truth, she could offer her name in return. Jake turned to look at her, surprise evident even in the dim light. Most women would be backing away right now, not offering familiarity. Hannah considered his words carefully before responding. The man who helped me when I had no hope, who worked from sunup to sundown asking nothing in return, that's the man I've come to know. Whatever shadows follow you, they don't define who you are now. Something shifted in Jake's expression, a guardedness giving way to cautious hope. For a breathless moment, Hannah thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he turned back to watch the rain, which had begun to slacken. We should be able to continue soon, he said, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. Get home before dark. Home. The word hung between them, simple yet loaded with meaning. Hannah wondered if Jake realized what he'd said, that her solitary farmhouse had somehow become home in his mind as well. They rode back in companionable silence, the freshly washed landscape gleaming in the late afternoon sun. By the time they reached the farm, the storm clouds had dissipated entirely, leaving a brilliant sunset in their wake. As they unsaddled the horses, Hannah found herself studying Jake's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He had trusted her with his past, revealed vulnerabilities that must have been difficult to share. The admission should have frightened her, yet instead it had humanized him, making him more than just the capable stranger who had come to her aid. "Thank you for today," Hannah said as they carried their purchases to the house. "For everything." Jake's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Thank you for listening and not running in the opposite direction." That night, as Hannah prepared for bed, she found herself lingering at the window that faced the barn. A lantern glowed faintly through the barn door, Jake reading, perhaps, or writing in the small journal she'd noticed among his belongings. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas, to the life they had shared and the dreams that had died with him. For the first time, remembering him brought a bittersweet warmth rather than sharp pain. Thomas would have wanted her to survive, to thrive even. He had loved this land as much as he had loved her. Would he begrudge her finding help to preserve it, or finding comfort in another's presence? Hannah closed the curtain, but sleep eluded her long into the night. The following days brought a flurry of activity to the farm. With the field plowed and ready, planting began in earnest. Hannah and Jake worked side by side, dropping seeds into the freshly turned earth with methodical precision. "My mother always said to plant corn when oak leaves are the size of squirrels' ears," Hannah remarked, wiping sweat from her brow. "Seems about right today," Jake nodded, surveying the oak trees that bordered the property. "Good timing, should have it all in before the next rain." As they worked, Hannah found herself stealing glances at Jake when he wasn't looking. The sun had darkened his skin to a deep bronze, and his movements held a natural grace that spoke of years of physical labor. He had begun to fill out slightly during his stay, the regular meals adding weight to his lean frame. More noticeable was the change in his demeanor. The guarded wariness that had marked his expression when he first arrived had softened. He laughed more easily, particularly in the evenings when they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Hannah mended clothes or Jake whittled small wooden figures that he left around the house, a tiny horse on the mantel, a delicate bird on the kitchen windowsill. On the 10th day of Jake's stay, as they finished planting the last section of field, Hannah confronted the question that had been hovering between them. "The planting's done," she said, brushing soil from her hands. "I suppose you'll be heading to Colorado soon." Jake straightened, shading his eyes against the setting sun. His expression was unreadable. "Suppose I should." Hannah waited, hoping he might say more, but Jake remained silent, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The unspoken words between them hung heavy in the air, unless. Hannah began, then faltered, unsure how to continue. Jake turned to her then, his blue eyes intent. "Unless," Hannah's heart hammered in her chest, "the barn roof still needs mending. And the west fence line has at least a dozen posts that need replacing before cattle drive season, or I'll have strays in the corn." A slow smile spread across Jake's face. "Sounds like a lot of work for a woman alone." "It is," Hannah agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. "Too much, perhaps." Jake took a step closer, close enough that Hannah could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Are you asking me to stay a while longer, Hannah Keller?" The use of her full name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "I'm suggesting it might be mutually beneficial. You need a place to catch your breath before Colorado. I need help with the heavy work." "Mutually beneficial," Jake repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Very practical of you." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm a practical woman, Mr. Morgan." "Jake," he corrected, his voice dropping lower. "If I'm staying longer, it really should be Jake." Hannah nodded, unable to look away from his face. "Jake." The way she said his name seemed to affect him. Something flickered in his eyes, a hunger quickly masked. He stepped back, breaking the tension between them. "I'll stay through the fence mending," he said, his voice deliberately casual. "After that, we'll see." It was enough for now, Hannah decided. A reprieve from the inevitable parting. time to sort through the confusing emotions that had begun to surface whenever Jake was near. That evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cool night breeze, a rider appeared on the road leading to the farm. Hannah tensed, unaccustomed to visitors, especially at this hour. Jake rose smoothly to his feet, positioning himself slightly in front of Hannah's chair. His hand didn't move toward a weapon, but his stance suggested readiness. The rider approached at an unhurried pace, eventually revealing himself to be Sheriff Miller from the nearby town of Millbrook. He tipped his hat to Hannah as he dismounted. "Evening, Mrs. Keller. Hope I'm not disturbing your peace." "Not at all, Sheriff," Hannah replied, though her hands clutched the fabric of her skirt. "Is something wrong?" Miller's eyes shifted to Jake, assessing him with professional interest. "Just making my rounds, checking on the widows and homesteaders living out a ways." His gaze lingered on Jake. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Jake Morgan," Jake said, extending his hand. Passing through and lending Mrs. Keller a hand with spring planting. Miller shook the offered hand, but Hannah didn't miss the way his other hand stayed near his gun belt. "Passing through from where exactly?" "Texas originally," Jake answered evenly. "Been working cattle drives the past few years." Miller nodded slowly. "Any particular reason you stopped here?" Before Jake could respond, Hannah interjected, "Mr. Morgan has been a godsend, Sheriff. I was trying to plow the field alone when he happened by. He's helped me get the entire crop planted, work I couldn't possibly have managed on my own." The sheriff's expression softened somewhat at Hannah's defense. "That's so? Well, that's neighborly of you, Morgan." "Just doing what anyone would," Jake replied. Miller snorted. "Not everyone, sad to say." He turned back to Hannah. "Had any trouble out this way? Been reports of a gang working the territory, hitting isolated farms mostly." Hannah shook her head. "Nothing like that, it's been quiet." "Good to hear." Miller mounted his horse, then fixed Jake with a penetrating stare. "How long you planning to pass through, Morgan?" Jake met his gaze steadily. "Long enough to help Mrs. Keller get her fences mended, then I'm headed to Colorado." Miller nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "You need anything, Mrs. Keller, you send word to town. And Morgan," he added, "always good to know who's in my jurisdiction." After the sheriff rode away, Hannah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm sorry about that." Sheriff Miller takes his responsibilities very seriously. Jake's expression was thoughtful as he watched the dust trail left by the sheriff's horse. "He's right to be cautious. A woman alone is vulnerable." He turned to Hannah. "Has there really been trouble in the area?" Hannah hesitated. "Some. The Peterson farm 5 miles east was robbed last month, and the stagecoach was held up twice since winter." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because I didn't want you to think I was afraid to be alone," Hannah admitted, "or that I was asking you to stay for protection." Jake's expression softened. "Hannah, there's no shame in recognizing danger. It's not weakness to seek safety." The use of her first name, spoken with such gentle concern, brought unexpected tears to Hannah's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to appear more vulnerable than she already felt. "I've managed thus far," she said, lifting her chin slightly. Jake's smile held a hint of sadness. "Yes, you have, admirably." He glanced toward the darkening road where the sheriff had disappeared. "But there's no medal for unnecessary suffering, Hannah. Accepting help doesn't diminish your strength, it multiplies it." The wisdom in his words struck a chord deep within her. For months, Hannah had equated independence with isolation, believing that relying on others somehow diminished her capability. Jake's perspective offered a different view, one where connection enhanced rather than diminished individual strength. "I'll remember that," she said softly. Jake nodded, then turned toward the barn. "I'll check the animals before turning in. Lock your door tonight, Hannah." As Hannah prepared for bed, she found herself dwelling on the sheriff's visit. Had he merely been making routine rounds, or was there something specific that brought him to her farm? The way he had studied Jake suggested more than casual interest. For the first time, Hannah wondered about Jake's past in concrete terms. He had admitted to riding with men who broke the law, but how serious had those offenses been? Was he being hunted? The possibility sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air. Yet when she thought of the man who had worked tirelessly beside her, who had treated her with unfailing respect and kindness, who created delicate wooden figures with the same hands that mended fences, she couldn't reconcile him with a dangerous criminal. Hannah slept fitfully, her dreams a confused jumble of plowed fields and running figures. She woke before dawn, drawn from troubled sleep by a sound she couldn't immediately identify. Pulling on her robe, Hannah moved to the window. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could make out Jake's figure in the yard below. He was chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of the axe the sound that had woken her. Hannah watched him for several minutes, mesmerized by the fluid economy of his movements. Even in this mundane task, there was a grace to Jake that spoke of a deep physical awareness, a man completely at home in his body. As if sensing her gaze, Jake paused and looked up toward her window. Though she knew he couldn't see her through the curtain, Hannah stepped back instinctively, her heart racing as if she'd been caught in some impropriety. By the time Hannah dressed and came downstairs, Jake had stacked enough firewood to last a month. He stood at the water pump, washing up, his shirt hanging on the nearby fence post. Hannah froze in the doorway, unprepared for the sight of Jake's bare torso gleaming with water in the early morning sun. A long scar ran diagonally across his back, a knife wound, perhaps, and smaller marks peppered his shoulders and sides. His body told the story of a hard life, yet maintained a power and vitality that made Hannah's mouth go dry. She must have made some sound, for Jake turned suddenly, reaching for his shirt in a movement that seemed more instinctive than modest. "Morning," he said, pulling the garment over his head. "Thought I'd get an early start." "I see that," Hannah replied, willing her voice to remain steady. "You've cut enough wood for half the summer." Jake's smile was apologetic. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be useful." Hannah nodded, understanding the need to exhaust the body when the mind was too active. "Breakfast will be ready soon." As she turned back to the house, Jake called after her. "Hannah," she paused, looking back at him. "About what the sheriff said yesterday, if there's trouble in the area, maybe I should stay a bit longer than we discussed, until things settle down." The offer sent a conflicting wave of relief and uncertainty through Hannah. Part of her welcomed the extended protection Jake offered, another part worried about her growing dependence on his presence. "The fences still need mending," she said finally. "After that, we can discuss what makes the most sense." Jake nodded, accepting her non-committal response. As Hannah returned to the kitchen, she found herself questioning her own reluctance. Was she protecting her independence, or was she simply afraid of acknowledging how much Jake's presence had come to mean to her? The next several days passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Jake began repairing the fence line, replacing rotted posts and mending broken rails. Hannah divided her time between household tasks and helping in the fields, checking on the newly planted crops and pulling early weeds. In the evenings, they continued their habit of sitting on the porch, talking until the fireflies emerged. Jake shared stories of places he'd seen, the vastness of the Texas plains, the rugged beauty of the Arizona territory, the bustling streets of St. Louis. Hannah found herself captivated not just by the tales themselves, but by the animation in Jake's face as he told them. On the fourth night after the sheriff's visit, as they sat watching a particularly vibrant sunset, Jake suddenly asked, "Do you ever think of leaving here, starting fresh somewhere else?" The question caught Hannah by surprise. "Leave the farm?" This was Thomas's dream, our dream. "Dreams can change," Jake said quietly, "especially when circumstances do." Hannah considered his words carefully. "Where would I go? What would I do? This land is all I have." "You have skills, Hannah, intelligence, determination." Jake's eyes held hers. "You could build a life anywhere." "Are you suggesting I abandon everything my husband and I worked for?" Jake shook his head. "Not suggesting anything, just asking if you've considered all your options." Hannah stood, suddenly needing movement. "This isn't just land, Jake. It's Thomas's legacy, our future. The children we plan to raise here." Her voice broke on the last words. Jake rose as well, his expression gentle. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," Hannah said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's just, I made a promise to Thomas, to myself, that I would make this work. Jake nodded, respecting her conviction even if he didn't fully understand it. Then we'll make sure you have every chance to keep that promise. The simple "we" in his statement warmed Hannah despite her emotional turmoil. Jake had included himself in her struggle without hesitation, offering partnership when she most needed it. As the night deepened around them, Hannah found herself standing closer to Jake than propriety might allow, drawn to the steady strength he emanated. When their hands brushed accidentally, neither pulled away immediately. The contact, brief as it was, sent electricity through Hannah's veins. I should turn in, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. Good night, Hannah. As she lay in bed that night, Hannah confronted the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Jake Morgan. The realization should have horrified her, a widow of less than 2 months, developing feelings for a man she'd known only weeks. A man with a past he himself described as troubling. Yet instead of shame, Hannah felt a curious lightening of her spirit. Thomas had been her first love, her companion through youth into adulthood. His death had left a void she'd believed would never be filled. Now she understood that the heart could expand to embrace new love without diminishing what came before. The question remained, did Jake feel the same? And if he did, what future could they possibly have together? The answer came sooner than Hannah expected, though not in a way she could have anticipated. The following afternoon, as Hannah hung laundry while Jake worked on the western fence line, she spotted riders approaching from the north, 3 men moving at a purposeful pace. Something about their formation sent a warning signal through Hannah's mind. They weren't traveling like neighbors or passers-by. Hannah dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and hurried toward the barn where she kept Thomas's old rifle. By the time she reached it, the riders were close enough for her to see their faces, hard, weathered countenances that held no neighborly intent. Her hands shaking slightly, Hannah checked that the rifle was loaded, then positioned herself on the porch, the weapon visible but not directly threatening. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she called as the riders entered the yard. "Something I can help you with." The leader, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, smiled without warmth. "Maybe so, madam. We're looking for a friend of ours. Heard he might be in these parts." Hannah kept her expression neutral. "I don't get many visitors out here. Who might you be looking for?" The scarred man dismounted, his movements casual but his eyes sharp. "Goes by Jake Morgan these days. Tall fellow, dark hair, blue eyes, bit of a wanderer." Hannah's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. "And if I've seen this man, then we'd be obliged if you'd point us in his direction." The man's hand rested casually near his holstered pistol. "Family matter, you understand." "You don't look much like family to me," Hannah said, her grip tightening on the rifle. The man's fake smile disappeared. "Listen, lady, we know Morgan's been staying here. Sheriff in town mentioned a stranger helping the widow Keller with her planting. Description fits Jake to a T." Hannah's mind raced. Jake was at the far end of the property, out of earshot. If she could stall these men, send them in the wrong direction. "Mr. Morgan was here," she admitted. "Left yesterday for Colorado, said he had family waiting." The scarred man studied her face, clearly assessing the truth of her words. His companions had dismounted as well, spreading out slightly in a way that made Hannah's skin crawl. "That right," the leader said skeptically. "Mind if we have a look around, make sure our friend didn't leave anything behind?" Before Hannah could respond, a voice came from behind the barn. "She's not lying about Colorado, Reed. That's where I'm headed." Jake stepped into view, his rifle held casually but unmistakably ready. "Just not quite yet." The scarred man, Reed, grinned, though his eyes remained cold. Well, Jake Morgan, large as life, been a while." "Not long enough," Jake replied, his voice steady as he moved to stand near Hannah. "What do you want, Reed?" Reed's expression hardened. "You know damn well what I want. $5,000 in gold that disappeared the same night you did, along with 2 of my men." Jake's face remained impassive. "I didn't take your gold. As for your men, last I saw them, they were planning to double-cross you anyway. Not my problem if they succeeded." Reed's hand moved closer to his gun. You're lying, Morgan. Always were good at that. Believe what you want, Jake said evenly. Then get on your horses and ride out. This lady's got nothing to do with ancient history. Reed's eyes flicked to Hannah, then back to Jake. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. Found yourself a widow to comfort, Jake. Always did have a soft spot for the ladies in distress. He took a step toward Hannah. Does she know what kind of man she's taken in? The things you've done? Step back, Reed, Jake warned, his voice dropping dangerously. Whatever's between us stays between us. Reed laughed, an ugly sound. Oh, I think the lady deserves to know. He looked at Hannah. Your friend here was the best confidence man in 3 territories, could talk a rattlesnake out of its venom. Used those pretty blue eyes to convince more than one lonely woman to invest in non-existent mines or hand over family heirlooms. Hannah glanced at Jake, whose expression had turned to stone. That was a long time ago, Jake said quietly. People change. Do they? Reed challenged. Or do they just find new marks? He turned back to Hannah. What's he after, madam? The farm, or just whatever valuables your late husband left behind? That's enough, Jake said, raising his rifle slightly. You've said your piece, now go. Reed's hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, Hannah stepped forward, her own rifle steady. Mr. Morgan asked you to leave. I'm asking too. This is my property and you're trespassing. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Reed smiled again, this time with grudging respect. Got yourself a spirited one, Jake. He backed toward his horse. We'll go, for now, but this isn't over. As the 3 men mounted up, Reed called over his shoulder, I'll be watching, Morgan. You try to leave this territory without settling up, you won't make it 10 miles. Hannah and Jake stood side by side, weapons ready until the riders disappeared over the rise. Only then did Hannah allow her rifle to lower, her hands suddenly trembling with delayed reaction. Are you all right? Jake asked, concern evident in his voice. Hannah nodded, not trusting herself to speak immediately. When she finally found her voice, it was steadier than she expected. Who were they, Jake? Really? Jake's expression was grim. Men I rode with years back, before I decided to change my ways. He hesitated. Reed wasn't lying about everything. I did some things I'm not proud of. But you didn't steal his gold, Jake shook his head firmly. No, that was his second in command, a man named Harlow. I discovered the plan, refused to be part of it. Left the same night they did, but in a different direction. Hannah studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. She found none, only regret and a steadfast honesty that confirmed what her heart already knew. I believe you, she said simply. Relief washed over Jake's features. Thank you. He glanced in the direction the riders had gone. But they'll be back. Reed's not the type to let go of a grudge, especially when money's involved. What will you do? Jake's eyes met hers, serious and determined. First, make sure you're safe, then. He sighed heavily. I need to clear my name. Find Harlow or evidence of what really happened. And in the meantime, Hannah asked, her chest tight with the implications. They know where to find you now. Jake nodded grimly. I should go. My presence puts you in danger. No. The word escaped Hannah before she could consider its implications. If you leave now, Reed will assume you're running, that his accusations were correct. He might take his revenge on me instead. Jake's expression darkened at the suggestion. I won't let that happen. Then stay, Hannah said, reaching for his hand without thinking. We'll face this together. Jake looked down at their joined hands, then back to Hannah's face. Something shifted in his eyes, a decision made, a boundary crossed. Together, he agreed softly, his fingers tightening around hers. That evening, as dusk settled over the farm, Hannah and Jake sat at the kitchen table, discussing their limited options. The rifle rested against the wall nearby, a reminder of the threat that now hung over them. Sheriff Miller needs to know about Reed and his men, Hannah said, pouring coffee into Jake's cup. They're clearly outlaws. Jake nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Miller already suspects I'm not just a passing cowboy. If I tell him about my past association with Reed, he's more likely to throw me in jail than help. Then I'll speak to him, Hannah decided, without mentioning the details of your history, just that these men threatened us. Jake considered this, then slowly nodded. It might work, but Hannah. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. You need to understand what you're involving yourself in. These aren't men who make idle threats. Hannah met his gaze steadily. I'm already involved, Jake, the moment they rode onto my land. The conviction in her voice must have convinced him, for Jake squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. We'll ride to town tomorrow, speak to Miller together. As Hannah prepared for bed that night, a new tension hummed through the house. Jake had insisted on sleeping inside on the floor in the main room, near the door rather than in the vulnerable barn. The knowledge that he was just beyond her bedroom door sent a flutter of awareness through Hannah that had nothing to do with the danger they faced. Morning brought a clarity of purpose. After a quick breakfast, Hannah and Jake saddled their horses and set out for Millbrook. The small town was an hour's ride from the farm, close enough for occasional supplies, far enough that Hannah rarely made the journey without specific need. Sheriff Miller's office sat on the main street, a solid building with a small jail attached to the rear. As Hannah and Jake tied their horses to the hitching post, Miller emerged, eyebrows rising at the sight of them. Mrs. Keller, Morgan. He nodded in greeting. What brings you to town? We need to speak with you, Sheriff, Hannah said. Privately, if possible. Miller's gaze sharpened, but he gestured them inside without comment. Once the door closed behind them, Hannah explained about the three riders, their threats, and their apparent vendetta against Jake. Said their leader's name was Reed, she finished. Claimed Mr. Morgan stole gold from them years ago, which he denies. Miller leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with renewed interest. And why would these men think you had their gold, Morgan? Jake met the sheriff's gaze directly. Because I used to ride with them, years ago before I straightened out my life. To his credit, Miller didn't immediately reach for his handcuffs. Go on. Jake explained his history with Reed's gang, his decision to leave, and the coincidental timing with Harlow's theft. Throughout the account, he was unflinchingly honest about his own past misdeeds, while emphasizing that he had committed no crimes in the years since. When he finished, Miller was silent for a long moment, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. You realize I could arrest you right now for admitting to past crimes? Yes, Jake acknowledged, but that wouldn't help Mrs. Keller, who's now in danger because of me. Miller's eyes shifted to Hannah. Is that how you see it, madam? That Morgan here has put you in danger? Hannah straightened in her chair. No, Sheriff, these men are the danger. Mr. Morgan has done nothing but help me since the day he arrived. Miller sighed heavily. Reed Dalton is bad business. I've had warnings about him from lawmen in 3 counties. Robbery, extortion, even murder when it suits him. He focused on Jake again. You're sure it was Harlow who took the gold? Jake nodded. As sure as I can be without witnessing it myself. He'd been planning it for months, complained to me about Reed shorting him on his share of jobs. And you didn't warn Reed because? Because I was leaving anyway, Jake said simply, and because Reed was no better than Harlow, just smarter about who he robbed. Miller considered this information, then came to a decision. I'll put out word to neighboring sheriffs about Reed and his men. If they're spotted, we'll bring them in. He fixed Jake with a stern look. As for you, Morgan, your story better be straight. If I find out you're playing me or Mrs. Keller, you'll wish Reed had found you first. Understood, Jake said evenly. As they left the sheriff's office, Hannah felt marginally better. Having the law aware of their situation provided some comfort, though she harbored no illusions that Sheriff Miller alone could protect them from determined men. Jake seemed to share her thoughts. We should stop at the general store before heading back, he said. Stock up on ammunition just in case. The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation, but no riders appeared on the horizon. As night fell, Jake checked and rechecked the locks on the doors and windows, his vigilance both reassuring and disconcerting. You should try to sleep, Hannah said, finding him still awake long after she'd retired to bed. He sat in a chair near the front window, rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit yard. Jake glanced up at her, his face shadowed in the dim light. I will, just want to make sure all's quiet first. Hannah moved closer, drawn by something in his expression. You blame yourself for this. It wasn't a question, but Jake answered anyway. Yes, I should never have stopped here, should have kept moving, kept my troubles to myself. If you hadn't stopped, I would have lost my farm, Hannah said softly, possibly my life, working myself to exhaustion. Jake's eyes found hers in the darkness. And now you might lose both because of me. Hannah shook her head firmly. That's not going to happen. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. We'll get through this, Jake, together. Jake caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment before gently lowering it. Hannah, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you should know, the things Reed said about me conning women, that part was true. Hannah waited, sensing he needed to unburden himself fully. I was good at making people trust me, Jake continued. Especially women alone, widows, spinsters with inheritance. He swallowed hard. I'd make them believe I cared, get close enough to learn about their valuables, then disappear with whatever I could carry. The confession hung between them, Jake clearly expecting it to destroy whatever regard Hannah might have for him. Instead, she asked simply, and now, are you conning me, Jake Morgan? The question seemed to startle him. No, he said vehemently. God, no, Hannah, that's not who I am anymore. That's why I had to tell you so you'd know I'm not that man now. Hannah studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse, the desperate need for her to believe in his redemption. I know who you are, she said quietly. You're the man who stopped to help a stranger when you had nothing to gain. Who worked alongside me without complaint. Who carves beautiful things with the same hands that once took what wasn't yours. Jake's expression was a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. How can you possibly trust me after what I've told you? Because people can change, Hannah said simply. You proved that the moment you took the plow and told me to rest. Something broke in Jake's expression, then a final barrier falling away. He stood, closing the distance between them in 2 steps, and then his hands were cradling her face with infinite tenderness. Hannah, he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Hannah had made her choice. She leaned into him, her hands finding his shoulders, anchoring herself as the kiss deepened into something that stole her breath and ignited a fire she'd thought extinguished forever. When they finally parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I never meant for this to happen, he murmured. Never thought I deserved someone like you. Hannah smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months despite the danger surrounding them. Perhaps that's exactly why you do deserve it, because you don't think you do. Jake's answering smile transformed his face, erasing years of wariness and regret. He might have kissed her again, but a sound from outside instantly restored his vigilance. Moving to the window, he peered into the darkness. Just the wind, he reported, though his posture remained alert. But Hannah, this doesn't change the fact that you're in danger because of me. I need to resolve this situation with Reed one way or another. We will, Hannah assured him, emphasis on the we. But not tonight. Tonight we both need rest. Jake nodded reluctantly. Go back to bed. I'll keep watch a while longer. Though Hannah wanted to protest, she recognized the need in Jake to protect her, to prove through action the change he claimed in words. She pressed a quick kiss to his cheek before returning to her room, her mind and heart too full for immediate sleep. The next 3 days passed without incident, though the waiting created its own kind of tension. Jake divided his time between completing the fence repairs and maintaining a watchful guard. Hannah continued her usual farm tasks, refusing to let fear dictate her daily life. In the evenings, they allowed themselves brief respites from vigilance. Jake taught Hannah to play poker using dried beans as chips. Hannah shared stories of her childhood in Kentucky, of her parents and the sister who had died young of scarlet fever. They discovered a shared love of Mark Twain's writing and a mutual dislike of overly sweet desserts. And sometimes, when the conversation lulled, Jake would simply take her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that sent shivers up her arm. These quiet moments of connection became precious islands of normalcy in their sea of uncertainty. On the 4th morning, as Hannah gathered eggs from the henhouse, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart rate accelerated, but she forced herself to move calmly, carrying her basket of eggs toward the house where Jake was repairing a loose floorboard on the porch. Jake heard the riders too, She could tell by the way he casually picked up his rifle before standing. But as the horses came into view, relief replaced tension. It was Sheriff Miller, accompanied by a deputy Hannah didn't recognize. "Morning," Miller called as they rode into the yard. "All quiet out here, so far," Jake replied, lowering his rifle slightly but keeping it handy. "Any news?" Miller dismounted, signaling his deputy to do the same. "Some, that's why we rode out," he nodded to Hannah. "Mrs. Keller." "Sheriff," Hannah acknowledged. "Would you like some coffee? It's just brewed." Miller accepted gratefully, and soon they were seated at the kitchen table, the deputy remaining outside to keep watch. "We picked up one of Reed's men in town last night," Miller explained, warming his hands on the coffee cup. "Drunk, running his mouth at the saloon about teaching Morgan a lesson." Jake tensed. "Which one?" "Calls himself Blackie, missing 2 fingers on his left hand." Jake nodded grimly. "He's new, wasn't with the gang when I rode with them." "Well, he sang like a canary once we locked him up," Miller continued. "Reed's planning to hit your place tonight, figures you'll be expecting them to come during daylight, so they're aiming for midnight or after." Hannah's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. "How many men?" "5, according to Blackie. Reed, the 2 you saw before, and 2 more he picked up in Millbrook." Miller's gaze was serious as he looked from Hannah to Jake. "I've deputized 4 men. We'll be here before sundown, set up a proper reception for them." Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're helping us," Miller snorted. "I'm upholding the law, Morgan. Reed Dalton's wanted in 2 states. The fact that taking him down helps you is incidental." But there was a twinkle in his eye that suggested he wasn't entirely displeased by the coincidence. After discussing strategy for the coming confrontation, Miller and his deputy rode back to town, promising to return with reinforcements before nightfall. Once they were alone, Hannah turned to Jake, unable to hide her nervousness entirely. "What do you think? Can we trust Miller's plan?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Miller's a good lawman, but Reed's cunning, and if he suspects a trap." He shook his head. "We need to be prepared for anything." Throughout the afternoon, they made their own preparations. Jake showed Hannah how to load and fire his pistol in case her rifle was impractical in close quarters. They moved valuables and essential supplies to the root cellar, which could serve as a last refuge if necessary. Jake fashioned crude barricades for the downstairs windows using furniture and spare lumber. As the sun began to set, Sheriff Miller returned as promised, bringing 4 armed deputies. They positioned themselves strategically around the property, 2 in the barn, 1 in the corn crib, Miller and the last deputy in the house with Hannah and Jake. "Now we wait," Miller said, checking his pocket watch. "Might be a long night." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Hannah found herself jumping at every creaking board and rustling leaf. Jake remained outwardly calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the alertness in his eyes as he periodically checked each window. Shortly after midnight, a soft whistle from outside the signal from one of the deputies that riders were approaching. Miller immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness broken only by slivers of moonlight through the curtains. "They're coming from the east," the deputy whispered, joining them at the window. 6 riders moving slow." 6, Jake frowned. Blackie said 5, Miller shrugged. Either he lied or they recruited another gun. They waited in tense silence as the riders approached the darkened farmhouse. Through a gap in the curtains, Hannah could make out Reed's distinctive figure dismounting, gesturing for his men to spread out around the property. "Hold your fire until they make a move," Miller instructed in a hushed voice. "I want them clearly in the wrong before we start shooting." Minutes passed like hours as Reed and his men crept closer to the house. Hannah's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Beside her, Jake's breathing remained steady, but she could feel the coiled tension in his body, ready to spring into action. The silence shattered with the crash of breaking glass as one of Reed's men smashed a side window. "Morgan," Reed's voice called out, "come on out and face me like a man. Bring the gold and maybe we'll let your widow live." Miller nodded to his deputy, who slipped out the back door to alert the men in the barn. Then the sheriff stood, positioning himself to the side of the front window. "This is Sheriff Miller," he shouted. "You men are trespassing on private property and threatening its occupants. Throw down your weapons and surrender." A moment of stunned silence followed, then a burst of gunfire as Reed and his men opened fire on the house. Hannah ducked instinctively as bullets splintered wood and thudded into walls. "So much for surrendering," Miller muttered, returning fire through the window. The shootout erupted in earnest then, gunfire coming from multiple directions as the deputies in the barn and corn crib revealed their positions. Reed's men, caught in a crossfire, scrambled for cover. "Stay down," Jake urged Hannah, positioning himself between her and the windows. But Hannah had no intention of cowering while others fought her battle. She moved to a position near the rear window, her rifle ready. When a shadow moved past the window toward the back door, Hannah didn't hesitate. She fired and was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sound of a body falling heavily against the porch steps. "Good shot," Jake said, genuine admiration in his voice. The gunfight continued for what seemed like hours but was probably less than 15 minutes. Eventually, the shooting from outside decreased, then stopped altogether. Miller cautiously approached the window. "Reed," he called. "It's over. Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up." A tense silence followed, broken only by the moans of wounded men. Then, unexpectedly, gunfire erupted again, this time from directly outside the front door. The wood splintered as bullets tore through it. "Get back," Jake shouted, pulling Hannah away from the line of fire just as the door burst open. Reed stood in the doorway, a pistol in each hand, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. His eyes were wild, fixed on Jake with murderous intent. "You ruined everything, Morgan," he snarled, raising both guns. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Jake lunged forward, tackling Reed even as the outlaw fired. They crashed to the floor together, struggling for control of the weapons. Hannah watched in horror as one of the pistols discharged, the sound deafening in the confined space. For a terrible moment, both men went still. Then Jake rolled away from Reed, who remained motionless, a dark stain spreading across his chest. "Jake," Hannah rushed to his side, frantically checking for wounds. "I'm all right," Jake assured her, though his voice was shaky. "Bullet caught him, not me." Miller knelt beside Reed, checking for a pulse before shaking his head grimly. "He's gone." The sheriff looked up at Jake. "Clean shoot, Morgan, self-defense with plenty of witnesses." Outside, the deputies had rounded up the remaining members of Reed's gang, 2 dead, 3 wounded but alive, and 1 who had surrendered without a fight. As dawn broke over the farm, Miller and his men prepared to transport their prisoners back to town. "You'll need to come in tomorrow to give formal statements," Miller told Hannah and Jake. "But after that, this business should be finished." He paused, looking at Jake with newfound respect. "You handled yourself well, Morgan. Ever consider more legitimate employment?" "Deputies' pay isn't much, but it's honest work." Jake looked surprised by the offer. "I'll consider it, Sheriff, thank you." As the lawmen rode away with their prisoners, Hannah and Jake stood on the porch, surveying the damage to the farm. Bullet holes pockmarked the house and barn, a window lay shattered, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. But the crops remained untouched, the animals unharmed, and most importantly, they had survived. "We'll need to start repairs right away," Hannah said, mentally cataloging the work ahead. "Before it rains again." Jake turned to her, an unreadable expression on his face. "Hannah," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something important." Hannah's heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "Yes." "Reed is dead, his men are in custody, the threat is over." Jake took a deep breath. "I could leave now, continue to Colorado as I planned, or, Hannah prompted when he hesitated. Jake took her hands in his blue eyes intent on her face. "Or I could stay here with you." He swallowed hard. "If that's what you want." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming emotion. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Morgan, a farming partnership?" A smile tugged at Jake's lips, recognizing her deliberate echo of their earlier conversation. "Not exactly, Mrs. Keller." His expression grew serious again. "I'm proposing something permanent, something based on more than practical considerations." "Such as?" Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Such is the fact that I've fallen in love with you, Jake said simply. That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me, that I want to help your dreams for this farm come true and create new dreams together. Joy bloomed in Hannah's chest, so intense it was almost painful. Even though I'm stubborn and proud and tried to plow a 40-acre field by myself, Jake laughed softly, especially because of that. His fingers tightened around hers. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Hannah Keller. And I'd be honored to stand beside you for whatever comes next. Hannah looked up at the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to an unspoken prayer, a man who had faced his past and chosen a better path, who had protected her home and her heart with equal dedication. Yes, she said, the word carrying all the certainty in her soul. I want you to stay, Jake Morgan, not as a hired hand or a temporary helper, but as my partner, my husband, when enough time has passed to honor Thomas's memory properly. Jake's face transformed with happiness, years of wandering and regret giving way to the promise of belonging. He gathered Hannah in his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and futures shared. As they stood together on the battered porch of the farmhouse that had become their home, the morning sun rose fully over the eastern fields. The newly planted crops stretched before them in neat rows, tender green shoots already reaching toward the light, a perfect metaphor for the new life taking root between them. 6 months later, on a crisp October day with the harvest safely gathered, Hannah Keller became Hannah Morgan in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. Sheriff Miller stood as Jake's best man, and Mrs. Peterson, whose initial suspicions had given way to genuine friendship, attended Hannah. The farm flourished under their joint care. Jake's knowledge of animal husbandry complemented Hannah's skill with crops, and together they expanded operations to include a small herd of cattle and an orchard of apple trees. Jake never did take Miller up on the deputy position, though he occasionally helped track outlaws when the sheriff needed someone with knowledge of criminal methods. Instead, he discovered that his hands, once used for taking, were equally skilled at creating. Thomas's leatherworking tools found new purpose in Jake's capable grip, and soon Morgan Leather Goods developed a reputation throughout the territory for quality and craftsmanship. 2 years after Reed's attack, Hannah gave birth to their first child, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Hope, a testament to the unexpected second chance that had brought them together. On summer evenings, when the day's work was done, Jake and Hannah would sit on the porch swing he had built for her birthday, watching their daughter play in the yard where they had first met. Sometimes, Jake would remind Hannah of that first day, how he had seen her struggling with the plow, too proud and determined to admit defeat. "I'm still glad you stopped," Hannah would say, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Even with everything that followed." "So am I," Jake would answer, his arm tightening around her. "Every day I'm thankful I took that plow and told you to rest." And Hannah, surrounded by the love and life they had built together, would smile at the memory of a dusty cowboy who had changed the course of her destiny with a simple act of kindness on a spring afternoon long ago.